continuing our chat about the Royal Navy, and I thought that it would be fun to talk about life in the Royal Navy during the Age of Sail, especially because there are a lot of misconceptions about Royal Navy life. We get a lot of these from movies, we get a lot of these from the clickbait articles or just uninformed news articles about the time period. And certainly to our modern first world sensibilities, life in the Navy was hard. There was bad food, there was cramped living quarters, harsh living conditions, what we see as very over-the-top discipline, and there's also this concept of, you know, the sailors and the regular seamen lived kind of a life of squalor, and the officers lived like royalty. But if we look at it from an 18th and early 19th century viewpoint, it was actually not the terrible life that it's portrayed as. So hopefully you find some of this information interesting. I find it fascinating. And let's dive into the living conditions on board a Navy ship. So to say that a Navy ship was crowded is a correct observation. On your biggest ships of the line, your first rates, you could have 880, close to 1,000 men on board that ship, all the way down to your lower ratings, which would have like 160 men on board one ship. The HMS Surprise, which we know from Master and Commander, which you can actually go see the replica ship at the San Diego Maritime Museum, and I highly recommend that. It's a gorgeous ship. But that ship is not huge by standards, and it would still have 200 men living on board. The regular seamen were granted 14 inches of space for their hammocks, which doesn't seem like a lot, although you do have to take in mind that not all 200 men or 800 men would be sleeping at the same time, because they had watches, and so you'd have a third of the crew up to half of the crew on the upper deck for their watch while the rest of the crew was sleeping. So you probably had more like 28 inches, but it doesn't seem like very much space. Now you have to take into consideration that a lot of these men would be coming from the slums of London. They would be coming from very poor areas where people were crowded in to these tiny dwellings, and so they weren't strangers to being crammed into tight places. And so the space is probably not going to affect them very much. They're not going to mind. Plus, in a lot of those situations on land, they're going to be sharing beds. They're not going to have a lot of room to maneuver in their houses. At least on board a ship, you have your own hammock. I think the greater shock would actually come for the officers, because unless you're the captain, you're going to be staying, and remember, most of your higher officers are going to be coming from the gentry in England, who are going to be used to big houses and having their own room and having servants and all of that. And then they're going to be put on a ship where, if they're a midshipman and still moving up their ranks, they're going to have very little space to themselves, and no room to speak of. But as an officer, they get a cabin, which on most ships you can probably come close to touching both walls of the cabin. just standing in the middle of it. And those walls weren't always even wood. Sometimes they would just be canvas. So we're talking about really, really tiny living spaces compared to what they were used to at home. Now, the captain had more space. Depending on how big the ship was, some of the smaller rated ships still had fairly small living spaces for the captains compared to what they would have been used to on land. But if you get up to the big ships like the HMS Victory, they actually have quite a bit of room. But you had to work your way up to being captain of a first rate. Touching on cleanliness, in a lot of films we see seamen being portrayed as very dirty. And on some ships that would have been true. Most other European navies had cleanliness issues. Your pirates and privateers, your merchant ships are not going to be as clean as the British Royal Navy ships. Cleanliness was actually a big thing for them, partially because they believed that having bad air is what caused illness. And so cleanliness was very important to them. Now, you can only get so clean using salt water for your washing, but they still adhered to a pretty strict cleaning schedule. It depended on the captain, for sure, but a lot of captains would have their crews cleaning the decks on a daily basis or at least a weekly basis. They would have days for cleaning sails, they would have days for cleaning clothes. It was very important to them that they keep everything as clean as they possibly could. They even had ventilators, which I thought was really interesting, that they started being installed on the ships in the 18th century to help pump air through and get the bad air out of the lower decks. So I thought that was really cool. Now let's touch on food. We'll be talking a little bit more about food next week, but a lot of people believe that food was terrible in the Royal Navy at the time period. And that definitely wasn't the case, especially compared to what they would have been used to on land. By today's standards, there wasn't a ton of variety, but in this time period, they were starting to realize that having a variety of food would prevent some of those malnutrition illnesses, such as scurvy. And by the Regency era, they had made citrus a part of daily rations because they didn't know the reasons, but they realized that having a regular ration of lemon juice is what was usually given, but they also did lime juice. That would prevent scurvy, and they hadn't completely eliminated it by the Regency era, the Napoleonic Wars, but they had much fewer problems with scurvy at that point. Another misconception is that they didn't have very much food, and this is completely false because they had like 4,000 to 5,000 calories a day, which they needed because work was definitely rough, but this was so much more than they would be getting at home. At home, they would not be able to get great food for great price. They would have to buy their own food, and they were not getting 5,000 calories a day. The Navy Victualling Board was pretty determined to get the best that they possibly could. Now, preservation was a difficulty, and so they tried their hardest to work around that, which meant that you got a lot of pickled things, you got a lot of salted things. Depending on your climate, I was even reading about On some voyages up by Canada, they would actually have frozen meats and stuff because they could keep it cold. And I thought it was interesting that there was actually rarely complaints from the sailors about their food, except for cheese, because as you can imagine, keeping cheese mold-free was a little bit difficult on a damp ship. So they would complain about their cheese, but beyond that, they really didn't complain that much about their rations. Now, the officers would have the same rations as the regular seamen. They did eat a little bit better because they could supplement with whatever stores they brought with them. And a lot of times the officers would pool their resources, and they'd have like one officer go secure some of their supplies that they would use throughout the voyage that were a little bit fancier, a little bit nicer. And they would have the cook prepare their own special order, aside from what the cook was preparing for the rest of the crew. But in the end, they were eating basically the same stuff. Now, touching on the subject of work. Work definitely was hard on board a ship, but it wouldn't have been that much harder than a lot of the labor jobs that they could have gotten at home. And it is interesting to note that on a Navy ship, they would be working significantly less than a sailor would be on board a merchant ship, because you had so many people on board the ship. You had way more people than you needed to sail that specific ship. A merchant ship of the same size could have 10 or 20 people manning the ship, whereas your Navy ship will have 200 people doing the same job. And the reason for this was they had to have between 10 and 15 people for each cannon, for each gun crew. So really you only needed those numbers when you were in battle. And so that meant that there was a lot more downtime. There was a lot more time to yourself and a lot less work than you would be getting on a merchant ship. For the officers, especially the young officers in training, they would suddenly be thrust into a schedule that was a lot more demanding than what they were used to. Back at home, they might have tutors, they might be going to a school and have responsibilities there, but they did not have the type of responsibilities that they would have been given on a ship. Like I said, a lot of these were sons of gentlemen who had servants to help dress them, to help take care of their clothes, their rooms, to feed them, everything. And once you get on the ship, you don't have really any of that. The captain might have a couple of servant-like positions, a steward or once in a while a servant, but the officers in large part would be dressing themselves, taking care of their own clothes. They did have somebody to cook for them, but they didn't really have people to clean up for them, and so they'd be doing a lot of these things on their own for the first time. They were also required to stand watch, and watches were 4-hour stretches. They just divided the day up, and they always had to have an officer on duty, and usually this would be the lieutenant. There were a couple of other officers that could be thrown in the mix, but you had to have one at all hours. And so your lieutenants would be up at midnight doing their watch. Whatever watch that they were assigned to, they had to do it. They couldn't just get their beauty sleep like they were used to. Now, one thing that you see a lot of in naval fiction and movies is discipline and very harsh discipline, specifically flogging. And sometimes it seems like that's all that they did. They always had flogging every day. And that is not the case. Usually a good captain would maybe flog someone once a year, twice a year. That's not to say that there wasn't corporal punishment. The officers definitely would rough the sailors around and stuff like that, but they would not inflict like lasting major injuries on their crew. So there was a sort of delicate balance that captains had to maintain. The number of officers was very small in proportion to the rest of the crew. And so they kind of had to maintain that hierarchy in order for there to be order on the ship. The captains who never used corporal punishment and were very lax usually didn't have enough respect from the crew, and they would have issues. And on the flip side, if you went way too far with too many floggings and too many beatings and really severe beatings, then you would also have problems with mutinies. Now, mutinies weren't usually violent. It was rare to have a violent mutiny. Mutinies were usually just the men refusing to work because they hadn't been paid or whatever. It was kind of their way of maintaining their rights. But there are a few stories about some pretty violent and brutal mutinies that happened because the captain was flogging and beating way too much. So another thing that we see in naval fiction and movies is a ton of fighting and a ton of engagements, which for most ships would not have been the case. For many, they would have gone weeks, if not months, in between engagements with the enemy. Fighting wasn't a constant in their lives. You also run into some timing issues with how battles are portrayed, and part of that is just the medium. Nobody wants to sit there for 30 pages while we're getting ready for a battle, or for an hour and a half until they come into range. We see movies like Pirates of the Caribbean where you see a ship and then like 30 seconds later you're shooting at them. That's not super realistic. It would definitely take time to arrange your crew, to get the right sails in place, to catch up to the ship. And there would be a lot of maneuvering as well, especially if the ship was trying not to engage. There could be a long chase before you actually start firing. So there wasn't a lot of instant battles. One example of this, and this is on the long end, but the Battle of Trafalgar, which we are celebrating next week. The Battle of Trafalgar, they first saw each other the evening before the battle, and they didn't actually end up engaging until noon the next day. And like I said, that's pretty slow. It depended a lot, that one, on the wind conditions. The winds were like almost non-existent, and so they were kind of going at a snail's pace. But it wasn't very usual for you to see a ship and then immediately be engaged. So there's a little glimpse into what naval life would have been like during the Age of Sail. There are a lot more things that we could talk about, and I will probably do a similar video going more in detail in the future. But for now, there's a little glimpse of it. If you want to know more about the Georgian era Navy, I highly recommend The Wooden World by N.A.M. Rodger. I have said it in the past, but N.A.M. Rodger is kind of the king of naval research. I think he's read every piece of paper there is connected to the Royal Navy in the UK archives. If you look at the back of his book, it's so well sourced. And so anyway, if you are writing or reading or just want to know more, definitely pick up this book. It's one of my favorites, and every time I read it, I get a ton of new stuff. So super interesting. And most of my information from this video comes from this book. There's your historical detail for the week. And next week we will be talking about Trafalgar Day and a little bit more in depth into food of the Royal Navy. And then after that, we'll probably talk a little bit more about the Battle of Trafalgar. So stay tuned for that, and there you have it.